Pompeii. The story of its destruction is renowned the world over. A town buried by a volcanic eruption, only to be rediscovered 1,500 years later. A treasure trove of artifacts uncovered. The surviving archaeology has preserved Pompeii in its final moments. But it's also revealed so much about life before the eruption, extraordinary glimpses into the world of the people who dwelled here. From wealthy villa owners, like the entrepreneurial businesswoman Julia Felix, to lowly men like Marcus Attilius, who fought and bled for the pleasure of others. Walking in their footsteps, I'll be exploring some of the most remarkable structures and meeting leading experts to better understand who these people were that made up this breathtaking town. This is the story of the people who called Pompeii home. Nestled in Campania, not far from the Bay of Naples, Pompeii's history covers almost 3,000 years. The town's origins date back centuries before Rome conquered Italy, but it became Roman in the early 1st century BC. Over the next 150 years, Pompeii filled with Roman-looking buildings, their walls covered with astonishing art and writing, sometimes elegant, other times obscene. It's Roman Pompeii that we see so much of today.
In 79 AD, Pompeii was home to about 15,000 people, and it would have been a hive of activity. This was a place of commerce. It was a place of connections across the length and breadth of the Roman Empire. It was a place of countless villas, both in Pompeii itself and in the surrounding countryside. Pompeii was a prosperous port town.
It was at the heart of one of the most celebrated parts of Italy for the Romans. The surrounding land and sea provided an abundance of resources. People of all nationalities ventured here, from Syrians to Britons. And emperors too would leave their mark, with many of them building lavish palaces along the Bay of Naples. Although it was never a significant city in the same way Rome was, Pompeii was a prosperous place, home to people from all levels of society. I've come to Pompeii to explore the stories of men and women who walked these streets almost 2,000 years ago. Extraordinary characters based all around the town who lived very different lives. To start my quest, I'm paying a visit to the house of one of Pompeii's wealthiest residents, where I'm meeting archaeologist Dr. Sophie Hay.
Welcome to the house of Julia Felix.
Now, who was Julia Felix?
Well, surprisingly, we actually know quite a lot about her, and that's because in 1756 they found a dipinto, basically a painted sign on the facade of this building, and on it, in literally big letters, was the name Julia Felix. And she was advertising for rent part of her house. So we know that this is her property. In terms of who she is, we know she's a citizen, which is very important, as she's got rights that a freed woman wouldn't have had. We assume that she's not married because it's her name doing the business side of things on the painted advert. So we don't know whether she's a widow, but she probably hasn't got a guardian looking after her, which is usual in the Roman period if you're a woman. You either have a husband or a father to deal with your businesses, but she seems to be going it alone. So I feel very strongly that she's sort of arrived in Pompeii and is shaking things up.
Just the sheer size of Julia Felix's property reveals a lot about her wealth. She had enough money to purchase not one, but 2 town blocks, known as insulae.
She joined these two blocks together, and in so doing got rid of a road that ran between them, you know, an important arterial road in Pompeii. So we're standing in her garden. Well, this is about 2/3 of the size of the property. And so the built-up part, her house, only occupies 1/3 of the space. So there's a lot being said there about ownership, wealth, and what she could do with her money.
This villa was one of the great mansions of Pompeii. You can imagine people walking past, peering inside as best they could from the nearby streets, and perhaps hoping to get a glimpse of this powerful and wealthy woman. And for those who were lucky enough to be invited inside as Julia Felix's esteemed guests, well, they discover a house built for the most luxurious living.
So Sophie, we've come to this interesting little enclave in the house of Julia Felix, but what is this area? What are we looking at here?
So we're standing in a dining room, which would have been called a triclinium. This, in terms of dining, is pretty much the most elite sort of situation you can get in a domestic context. You've got this couch with 3 sides, hence the word triclinium, and it's clad in marble, so sort of stating it's very sort of very posh dining area. And they would have been lying down on their sides, and behind them this little staircase that you can see is actually a water feature, and water would have been trickling down there, so they would have had, even in the heat, this sense of cool and calm. And then around them, they would have had scenes of the Nile. And you can see this beautiful blue colour, which is a very expensive blue pigment. And there's a crocodile and a little boat floating down the Nile.
I was going to ask, how could you tell that this is a Nile scene? But as you say, is it because of the crocodiles?
Absolutely, yeah, no. When we see crocodiles, we know that they're kind of representing the Nile, which for elite person, this is a way of communicating that they know of the exotic. Egypt is a faraway land to little Pompeians. So they're trying to sort of communicate that they understand exotic. And in fact, we have this whole kind of water feature in the garden, which they would have been looking onto as well. And did that represent the Nile in kind of more of a sort of physical form? We don't know, but I quite like that idea that the Nile theme, water, is really important to this house.
And so we think that Julia Felix herself may well have eaten at this triclinium.
Oh, I'm pretty sure she would have done. She would have been a fool not to enjoy these surroundings.
But Julia Felix didn't just enjoy the private pleasures of her grand estate, dining on fancy furniture. She was an entrepreneur, capitalising on her villa's position next to one of Pompeii's arterial roads to launch a clever business opportunity.
If we come through here, we get to see the very public face of Julia Felix.
Ah, so we've gone from private dining and this is public dining. So talk me through it, Sophie.
So this is a bar counter and people could come straight from the street, grab food and go.
Yeah.
But if they wanted to have a bit more of a leisurely lunch or food, they can come through, they would walk in, come through, and they could have food in her restaurant.
Well, let's have a look. Now, Sophie, this is such an interesting part of Roman dining because it's so different to the triclinium we were looking at earlier, isn't it? This feels more like 21st century going out to a pub or restaurant.
Yeah, it feels very familiar, this layout, certainly with these little upright benches, table in the middle. It's what we're used to. There might have been cushions on it, but essentially, yes, it's a very economic version of what we'd seen before and the opulence of everything.
And I presume the location-wise too, we've got the main street there, the amphitheatre not too far away. This is a prime location. This is cunning Julia Felix, isn't it?
Again, savvy again, yes. No, she knew what she was doing and she wanted to rent this space out, so she was getting an economy from it. But yeah, she knew she was sort of in the prime location for this sort of work.
In the corner of the restaurant was a small room, the kitchen, complete with an oven for cooking meats such as pork, lamb and duck, either served here in-house or at the counter overlooking the street. The whole building reveals Julia Felix as this impressive, independent businesswoman, her well-placed restaurant would have been buzzing with activity, with people from all walks of life.
Do we know what status of Romans would have been able to come to one of these restaurants?
Certainly freedmen and freed women, supposedly. Slaves would be coming maybe to grab food for their masters and taking it back to the shops where people were serving. So there's a lot of hustle and bustle here, and this, for reasons, this little restaurant here is probably a little bit of a scene of tranquility amongst the sort of bustle of the bar at the front. But still, it would be very lively. They're sort of talking animatedly, they're having discussions, arguments. We know that there are brawls in bars, drunken behaviour. So, we've got a lot of sort of Roman life kind of encompassed in this one room.
As you walk around more and more of Pompeii, you start to notice an abundance of buildings linked with food. On almost every street corner, you come across these counters, with built-in bowl-shaped hollows. The Romans called these places thermopoliums, what we would recognise today as fast food joints. Owned by entrepreneurial men and women similar to Julia Felix. And this is another of these popular food centres, a bakery, kitted out with millstones for grinding the grain and a large oven to cook the bread. Pompeii had more than 30 bakeries, filling the stomachs of the busy townspeople. This meant that whoever owned a bakery was reasonably well off. People like bakery proprietor Terentius Neo, famously pictured here alongside his wife. The couple lived several streets away from Julia Felix and converted part of their property into a bakery, no doubt selling their bread on the local street. 2,000 years ago, you can imagine walking along these streets with the smell of food wafting towards you from all directions. But in the area around Pompeii, there was one particular commodity that this region was renowned for: wine. The surrounding hills were covered with vineyards, climbing up the great slopes overlooking the Bay of Naples.
So why was this area of Italy so renowned for its wine production, for its viticulture? Well, a lot has to do with Campania's rich, fertile, volcanic soils, because towering over this area of Italy was this mountain, Mount Vesuvius. Vesuvius's nutrient-rich slopes were incredibly beneficial for Roman vine growers. That, alongside this area's easy access to water.
The Romans knew that this mountain was a special place, not because it was an active volcano. That, it appears, they didn't know, but because its soils helped to nourish a successful wine trade. The Romans loved this fruit of the vine. They even had a saying, "In vino veritas," in wine there is truth. And many of Pompeii's residents were sure to take advantage.
Alongside the frescoes, the casts, the graffiti, and all the other extraordinary archaeology that has been preserved at Pompeii, archaeologists have also uncovered the vine roots that people were growing at the time of the eruption.
From villa gardens to taverns, vineyards were all around Pompeii. One of the largest was here, at the Foro Boario.
So we're just outside the Foro Boario now, and its location is what's key here, because just opposite the vineyard is the amphitheatre, and the vineyard's close proximity to this great arena, the ancient Wembley, was no accident. You can really see the business element here behind Roman wine production, because as the games ended and people filed out of one of the exits or entrances, they would come out of the amphitheatre, they would see the vineyard right there, they might pop into the vineyard owner's tavern, have a drink, possibly have a bite to eat too, and then be on their way. So this is a great example of that business element behind Roman wine production almost 2,000 years ago.
But it wasn't just local wines that would be on sale in Pompeii. This was a busy port town, with traders from across the Mediterranean and beyond arriving and doing business here. Sophie's taking me to one of Pompeii's best placed bars, run by a man called Amarantus.
This is definitely a bar. We've got a nice wide entrance to the street to catch that passing trade from the amphitheatre all coming back. There's actually a garden in the back. We're not sure whether they used it as a beer garden essentially, but yeah, this is the bar of Amarantus.
Sextus Pompeius Amarantus is another of these actual residents of Pompeii. His bar was located along one of the busiest streets of the town, a few blocks down from the amphitheatre and Julia Felix's villa. Sophie and her team excavated Amarantus's bar. The results were extraordinary. They found the remains of his dog and his mule. The archaeologists also uncovered a graffiti depiction of Amarantus with a distinctly long nose, along with several mentions of his name, both on graffiti and on the amphorae wine containers he sold right here.
Do we know what types of wine would have been sold in, let's say, this bar of Amarantus?
So luckily for us, each of the amphorae that we know from the Roman world, slightly different shape for slightly different contents. And from the amphora that we found 50 that came from Crete, and we found a few that came from Kos, which is in the Aegean. We've got plenty of local amphora because wine is grown all over the Vesuvian area, so we've got lots of that. But then there's one amphora from Gaza. So it shows that sort of Amarantus may have had this quite exotic taste for wine and was trying to introduce it into the city. So yeah, he was, again, sort of a little entrepreneur in the wine world, perhaps.
I love how here, yes, you do have those local wines available for those Romans, but also this man is bringing in wines from, this far-flung corner of the Roman Empire, from the Eastern Mediterranean too.
It's incredible to think that a little Pompeian had that kind of foresight to sort of import wines. We know he had a mule, he owned a mule, so he could have easily gone to the port from here with his mule to collect the amphora off the ships direct from Crete and then bring it all the way back up here to sell to his clientele. This sort of would have sustained him and his family, so he needed the income. I guess he was sort of probably experimenting a bit with the Gazan wine, but evidently the Cretan wine was really popular because he had 50 jugs of this stuff.
Sophie, what I love about this place is how it humanises almost ancient Pompeii with people now walking by today. It really helps, alongside the archaeology, get a sense, I guess, of what it was like for these people trying to make a living in ancient Roman Pompeii.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that sort of hive of activity, the streets would have been filled with people all the time in the Roman period. So yeah, you're completely right. The tourists actually are sort of replicating that sensation for us.
These uneven streets, amazingly preserved today, were the great highways of Pompeii. Lined not just with shops and bars, but houses too. Professor Valerie Higgins has dedicated her life to researching Italian archaeology, including here at Pompeii.
Walking down one of these streets in ancient Pompeii, what was the layout? Were villas interspersed with houses of, let's say, less wealthy Romans?
Yeah, they were pretty intermixed. I mean, it's not like today where we have really very zoned cities. They didn't really experience city life like that, so they are pretty intermixed. However, there are some areas that maybe are a bit more elite. Like elite people today, for example, rich people really liked was to have a villa overlooking the sea with a lovely sea view and also, of course, nice cooling breezes. So on the side of the city that has good views over the sea, which is the northwest side, there are certainly more nicer villas there. But what you tend to get are these blocks, which we call insulae, and a large part of the insula will be taken up with a very nice villa. But then when you look at it, you'll see that there are sort of fill-in parts that are smaller rooms that often only have an opening onto the street. and some of those are shops, some of those are bars. But we now know from more recent excavation that some of those were where poor people lived. So they would be physically within the same block as a very rich person, but actually wouldn't have any contact with them. They would have a room which quite possibly only had the door as a source of light and air. And those people would live in one room, essentially.
Today, these people are nameless. Unlike Julia Felix and Amarantus, there was no writing on the walls that revealed who lived in these small rooms. Their stories have been lost. But we do know that they would have depended on the shops and services available along these streets.
But I think we have this idea that if you're quite well off, you go to restaurants, and there's something that sort of richer members of society do. But it was really the other way round in the Roman period, because if you were rich and wealthy, you would put a lot of money into having a very nice dining room and very nice cooks and very nice food. But if you lived in houses like this, which are just essentially one room, then you might not be able to cook. And so you would be very dependent on the bars and the takeaway places that were dotted all around the city.
Pompeii's bars and takeaways bustled with life, with noise. As did another, more infamous building.
This is a very, very dingy place. Small rooms, very dark stone beds, erotic frescoes all around. This is clearly a brothel.
The brothel is called the Lupina, the wolf's den. But lupa in Latin was also the word for a female sex worker. This was where they sold their bodies for sex. You can see graffiti in many of the rooms, mentioning specific prostitutes by their working names and what their clients thought of them. The sexual skills of Victoria, Felicula and Mola, the fellatio talents of Fortunata, her stage name cruelly meaning fortunate.
So who would come here? Well, not the rich. They had slaves for their own sexual pleasures. It's an uncomfortable fact, but it's true. No, the people who would come here and pay for a prostitute's time were people lower down the social order, people who didn't have their own slaves, but also people who weren't afraid to leave their mark on the walls of this establishment, their sexual boasts of their actions in this brothel.
Placidus was one such man, and he didn't hold back with his crude boast. Placidus hic futuit quem voluit. Placidus fucked here who he wished. For objectified sex workers like Fortunata, life here must have been horrific. Although this brothel is the building in Pompeii that we most associate with sex, erotic scenes were everywhere, from the baths to the villas.
Now, who you could have sex with depended on your gender and on your status. If you were an elite Roman man, you were almost certainly going to marry. But that didn't stop you having sex with other women apart from your wife without any punishment. You could have sex with one of your slaves. You could have sex with a prostitute. And you could have sex with other low-ranking women. That being said, there were some women who were off limits, such as elite Roman women or Roman freeborn women. Who a Roman woman could have sex with was much more strict, only her husband. Because the Roman public world was one dominated by men, and these men showed a great interest in the chastity of their wives. Having a chaste wife was a mark of honor for these men. And so if someone wanted to deride someone in a public office, they would send smears, they would send rumors that their wife
had been unchaste, had been unfaithful. And so to police this, the Romans introduced a number of adultery laws, heavily steered towards women, where the price for adultery could be very high indeed.
If convicted of adultery, a Roman woman would almost certainly be divorced, her reputation forever tarnished. She would lose property and be reduced to a status little better than a lowly prostitute. Prostitutes in Pompeii and elsewhere in the Roman Empire belonged to one of the most low-status social groups in Roman society, the infames, which translates literally as the infamous. But they weren't alone in this class. Dancers and actors were equally looked down upon, and so too were the infamous combatants that performed in front of thousands here in Pompeii. The men who fought here.
This is the Pompeii Amphitheatre, the oldest stone amphitheatre that we know of from the Roman world. And it's also a home of the arena sports.
These spectacles, called munera, followed a typical schedule. In the morning, you'd have beast hunts, where wild animals, sometimes exotic but mostly locally acquired, were pitted against each other or against specially trained fighters. Around midday, you'd have the executions. Condemned criminals would be killed in the arena in front of everyone, sometimes eaten alive by wild animals. Finally, the great climax to the munera, the gladiatorial combats. Trained fighters were pitted against each other for the entertainment of the crowd.
These grass areas in the arena, around the arena, was where there would have originally been wooden seating, because this amphitheatre could house around 20,000 spectators, more people than the actual size of Pompeii itself. It's great testament to the popularity of these games that people would venture to amphitheatres like this one to come and watch these blood sports.
These spectators watched on from up high as fighters emerged into the arena, chanting the names of these performers as they strode into view. Names like Elias, Princeps, and Felix. When you visit here today, you are literally walking in the footsteps of gladiators.
It's currently believed that roughly 10% of gladiators would die during one of these spectacles. But having said that, given the amount of fights a gladiator was expected to do over the course of his career, then the chances of him ultimately dying in one of these arenas was still very high indeed. Now, there wasn't a free-for-all in these arenas, in these amphitheatres, as to where you sat. Where you sat very much depended on your status. If you were an elite Roman, a patrician, a senator, for instance, you would be positioned here, closest to the arena floor, separated from the rest of the spectators. And I mean separated, because you'll notice here, this curtain wall. This was a symbol, a marker that those people this side were more important than those behind. They also, these elite figures, would come to this part of the amphitheatre through separate entrances, so they didn't mix with the rest of the spectators. As for the rest, they would come up, for instance, the exterior stairs of this amphitheatre at Pompeii, Women too were allowed to attend, but following a decree by the Emperor Augustus, they had to sit right at the back. It's another great example of how you experience pleasure, these arena sports in ancient Rome. Well, it very much depended A, on your status, and B, on your gender.
Munera proved incredibly popular amongst all ranks of Roman society. And with their popularity, another thing followed: gambling, where fans placed bets on their favourite gladiators.
This is another grim reality of Roman pleasures. As gladiators spilled blood for the pleasure of the crowd, some spectators would have little concern for the fate of the fighters themselves, and more concern over whether they made a profit.
For gladiators, the amphitheatre was a place of potential death. But these fighters actually spent most of their careers, their daily lives, in a very different place.
I've come to one of the most iconic buildings at Pompeii that's associated with gladiators. This is the Gladiator Barracks.
Situated several streets away from the amphitheatre, today the barracks is one of the most popular attractions in the whole town. In 79 AD, this was the home of gladiators, where they ate, where they slept, where they trained, where they lived. Archaeologists discovered helmets and armour here, alongside the remains of the gladiators themselves, and mentions of star gladiators survive throughout Pompeii. Etched onto columns and walls, their names live on. Calladus the Thracian, who boasted that he was adored by the girls. Marcus Attilius, a freeborn gladiator who, in his very first fight, defeated a great champion called Hilarus. Most gladiators in Pompeii were slaves, but despite their low status, they were also incredibly popular. They were sexy, they were valuable, the most successful were superstars of the ancient world. Dr. Mario Grimaldi is an archaeologist who has been working at Pompeii for more than a decade. He's taking me to see something very special, not far from the barracks, a very unusual piece of graffiti. The scratched image shows two gladiators fighting against each other with different weapons. On the right is a retiarius-type gladiator, equipped with a trident and an arm guard called a manica. On the left is a sword and shield-wielding fighter, a murmillo or secutor. And beneath them both is a line, indicating the arena floor. The graffiti itself is quite low down. It's believed that it was made by children.
This corridor is very interesting and important because connected a very important street of named Stabiano Street to the theater and after also to the School of Gladiators. And the decoration talk about of this changement to us because the graphics say, okay, now I can go to see the theater, but I can go also to see the gladiators. And the children that living in this area was very attractive from the presence of the gladiators in this area. And created the graphics for the fighting that maybe for them is impossible to see in the amphitheater, but it's possible to see in the School of Gladiators.
This graffiti, created by children some 2,000 years ago, is an extraordinary piece of surviving archaeology. These lowly gladiators weren't just popular with adults, but young children too, fascinated by men like Calladus, brought to Pompeii from overseas.
For them, it's like the player of soccer today for our son. It's like this. The idea that this is the very strong man, the very come from different country, like our soccer players, no? Arrive from the different country in a new city. And it's possible to see, to listen also different languages, see different color, of people, understand that there is a world outside the little city of Pompeii. And all of this was connection from the harbor near this gate from the presence of the gladiators, of slave gladiators in this school.
We can never know for sure, but the famous freeborn gladiator Marcus Attilius did fight as a murmillo, with sword and shield, and it's not impossible that the figure on the left of this graffiti actually represents the champion beater himself. It's graffiti like this, and well-preserved buildings like the barracks, that makes Pompeii so important for archaeologists wanting to learn more about the gladiators themselves. Surviving archaeology has revealed so much about life in Pompeii 2,000 years ago. By 79 AD, this was a prosperous port town with people from all levels of society making a living. Overall, life in Pompeii was good. And yet beneath all of this, there loomed a terrible danger. Unbeknown to them, deep within Mount Vesuvius, a cataclysmic volcanic eruption was nearing. But Vesuvius had been sending warnings for years. Earthquakes had repeatedly plagued Pompeii. One of the most severe had devastated large parts of the town in 62 AD.
Now we know it was a severe earthquake from the archaeology because repair work was still occurring at Pompeii at the time of the eruption almost 20 years later. But despite this, for all intents and purposes, Pompeii was a city on the mend, getting back on its feet. Those buildings which had been damaged were either being repaired or in some cases improved.
These large-scale repairs are still visible today, right at the heart of the town. It's something that has fascinated Sophie for years.
What we have here is a really, really clear example of the original build in this sort of light stone, and this whole corner of the building had collapsed during the earthquake, and they've rebuilt it but using a completely different material, these wonderful Roman terracotta bricks, and you can see how it's sort of slightly higgledy-piggledy but keyed into what the original building was like. But that is a really clear sign that there is serious damage being done.
So which came first?
So these light blocks are first. This is all the original build.
Okay,
and
right.
all this later brickwork is kind of keyed in. Even the detail at the top, you can see where the pediment is. It's kind of following on from what was already there and what the initial architecture looked like.
So that's more triangular,
yeah,
and that one's been more semicircular, isn't it?
Yeah, there it is. It's sort of another really physical sort of manifestation of these earthquakes.
So walls, exactly. So walls like this can actually tell us a lot about the state of Pompeii in those years running up to the eruption itself.
Exactly, yeah.
We have no idea how people like Julia Felix and Amarantus felt about these earthquakes, but clearly life carried on. Business was good. Pompeii remained a vibrant town full of life. People from all walks of life still went about their daily business. And whilst wealthy Julia Felix would have had very little in common with a Pompeian prostitute like Fortunata, or a gladiator like Marcus Attilius, they do share a tragic tale. A great disaster that would bind their fates. When the sky turned dark, the sea rescinded from the bay, and the town was frozen in time.